Welcome to another episode of our Heritage Buildings podcast. I'm Vincent Reed, your host. Today's guest is Ed Morton. Ed is a conservation accredited engineer and is the managing director of the Morton Partnership. With over 30 years of experience, Ed specialises in conserving, repairing and adapting historic buildings and structures. He is the appointed engineer to iconic UK cathedrals, including Westminster Abbey and York Minster. Ed plays an active role in the field through his positions with the Institute of Historic Building Conservation Technical Subcommittee and the ICOMOS UK Wood Committee. He is also an author, notably serving as the principal contributor to the English Heritage Practical Building Conservation book on timber. So welcome, Ed, to the show. It's an absolute pleasure.
Evening, Vincent, and great to be here.
What inspired you to specialise in structural engineering? And did it begin with structural engineering or something else?
If I'm honest, it really started with my father, who was a structural engineer, started his own practice in the 60s, and I grew up with engineering in a way. And to be honest, when I went to university, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I did a civil engineering degree, but my father was often taking me around buildings and sites, and he became involved with historic buildings early on in the 80s when conservation started to be a proper industry. So I really sort of grew up with it in a way. So that gave me the inspiration. And by the time I joined the practice in the very early 90s, my father was working on a huge number of historic buildings around the country. So that's probably what drew me into it.
There wasn't a reluctance thinking, I don't want to go into the same profession as my father, because some children just go the opposite end. You were genuinely fascinated and interested in it.
Very much so, and particularly the historic buildings, which is completely opposite to my own children, who all say, we don't want to work as hard as you work, Dad. So they're all going off in different things.
Are they YouTube influencers now?
Oh, all sorts of things, yes. But one of them's doing that with golf, yeah.
Brilliant. That's great. So you had a passion at an early age. That was good, because sometimes youngsters just don't know what they want to do, and it's great. When I interviewed Tim Floyd, he also from an early age had a passion. That was very different from me. I didn't at an early age. That passion took a bit of time to get, so it's good that you had that when you were young.
It grew on me as well, Vincent, very much. So I always had a fascination with history at school, and through that period, history and going to old buildings was always part of what I did. But I think, when I started with my father, I also did a course with the Architectural Association. And as much as the lectures were fantastic, it was actually the people on the course with me which really drew me in. They were conservation officers, planners, architects, all sorts, English heritage at the time. And I think just talking to them and becoming friends with them, my passion grew massively during that 2-year period.
So tell me, what is a structural engineer? And can you just sort of give me a brief example of what this entails? We're going to go into it in more detail a little bit later, but just generally, what does a structural engineer do?
I suppose in simplistic terms, we make things stand up. The most simple thing is somebody wants to remove a wall from a building, and they want to know if that wall is load bearing and whether they need to put a beam into the position where they've removed the wall to support the structure above. So yeah, I always, when I talk to students, we make sure the building stands up. I think that the slight difference when you become involved with conservation engineering, you also have to have a much more rounded understanding of other issues, architecture, aesthetics, materials, etc. Because what you're doing is imposing something on the historic building or structure.
Yeah. My next question is, so what would you say the key principles you would need to follow when you're working on a conservation project? Because it's very different, isn't it, from a new build?
I think for me, the key principles are understanding and significance. You need to really understand what you're dealing with. You need to delve into the structure to understand what the component parts are, how they're interacting with each other, how the loads are being transferred down that structure. Significance is understanding how important are the parts that you are dealing with. The significance may relate to a more holistic view of a building or structure, or indeed the significance may come from somebody who lived in the building. So I think understanding how it's put together, the materials, the technology, the loads, and then the significance are the key areas for me.
Yeah. It's funny, we're all sort of a bunch of detectives, really, aren't we? You have to know so many different things and find out this and that and what has happened. I feel like I'm a detective when I'm going to consult on a project.
It's very true. It's keeping your eyes open the whole time. And I'm sure that, I often, when I lecture, 90% of what I do is common sense, but it's also having the confidence, then to make the decision based on that common sense. But a lot of it is absolutely detective work. I ran a course in Jersey a couple of weeks ago, and I like to get. We had quite a lot of engineers on that one as it happened, and rather than me just talking to them for the whole day, I like to actually go round a building and set them a task. So we had a fabulous Jersey farmhouse which is dilapidated, and it's just sending them round there, giving them tasks to do, saying to them, how old's the building? When we sit down afterwards and discuss it, and I say, well, how old's the building? And they say, well, how are we meant to know from, looking at it? I said, well, what about the date stone that was on the house? Oh, we didn't see that bit, so it's
Yeah.
those little basic clues which are always there if you search hard enough.
Yeah. I always remember having a conversation, I think it was in Bilbao where we met, as there was an ICOMOS conference. Sometimes I find that to hold a building up, people are often too keen to throw lots of steel at it. And when it's a period property and it's a wooden structure, the amount of times I've been in and they say, oh, we're going to put a big steel underneath this staircase, for instance. And I'm thinking, do you need to do that? Let's look at the structure of the staircase first. It's balancing that sort of modern engineering text with traditional building methods.
Yeah, that's a sort of interesting case. And maybe I can just recount a little tale, because as a conservation accredited engineer, I do get approached by local authorities to look at applications. So I had a developer ring me, and I think his words were, I've been told I've got to get someone like you to come down and look at my building and tell my engineer if what he's doing is okay. So he was clearly very grumpy, and understandably that he was going to have to pay somebody to come down. And the key thing to me was, okay, well, look, I'm happy to do it. I'm very happy to come down, but I would like to meet your engineer on site. I don't want to get into a long sort of paper chase of, I write a report, he writes a report, etc. So I agreed to meet the engineer, and the developer came along, and we got on fine. And we walked around this timber frame building, and I asked the engineer to just say where your concerns are. And he sort of pointed up to a cross beam and a spine beam connection. And he goes, well, I'm really quite worried about that junction. It doesn't look great. And I said, okay, well, you stay here, and I'm going to go upstairs. So I went upstairs and jumped up and down on the floor. Then I came back down, and he goes, oh, that wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was going to be. Anyway, we carried on walking around the building in that same vein. And at the end of it, we by and large actually agreed that we could do much less to the building. He agreed to write a report, so I didn't have to write it. I just wrote a validation afterwards saying, this is what we discussed and I'm happy with this, which went to the local authority. But the interesting thing was the developer then took me on one side and he said, Ed, he goes, that's brilliant. I think you've saved me about 40 grand this afternoon. The most important thing in a way was actually hopefully that engineer next time will look at a building with a slightly different perspective. So that education aspect of it is really big, and I love being able to sort of play that little role in hopefully guiding somebody into how they may look at something in the future.
I completely agree. When I walk into properties, my approach is, what's the very least that I can do? I think some people, they're told that there's an issue and they go in there and want to prove that they're getting paid a certain amount of money. They want to prove something, right? Well, you have to do this and you have to do that. I see, when houses, let's say a house is built in 1720 and it gets put up, a lot of people don't realize that house moves in the first sort of 10, 20 years of its life, and it's crooked after about 20 years, but it's been there for 250 years crooked. And then you'll get somebody coming in and going, oh my God, the staircase is really crooked and it looks very, very dangerous. I say that's been there forever. It's locked in there now. It's
absolutely. I think the other one, which little story I'll tell you, is I did a survey for a couple, and they were friends of a friend of a nice small country house in Wiltshire. And I went down and did the survey. And if I do a survey like that, I always want to meet the people who are buying the house and actually walk around with them. And, because you can point and you can tell a story much more. Anyway, my friend rang me up a couple of days later and he said, Ed, the people you did the survey for, do you know what they said about you? And it's like, oh God, have I really put my foot in it? And he said, well, they said that it felt like you were surveying them to see if they were fit for purpose for the house. And, actually, it's really true because, if they're not willing to accept some damp areas and some drafts and, there's going to be more maintenance, well, maybe that house isn't for them. So, I've sort of taken that forward when I do house buying surveys and think, well, that is really true. You want to make sure that people are a good fit for the house.
I sometimes say to my clients, please don't take this the wrong way, but you're my number 2 priority here.
Yeah, well, I often say, whilst you may be paying my bill, I see the client as the building. They look at you rather strangely.
So what would you say are some of the most challenging projects that you've worked on, and how did you overcome those challenges?
I think there are challenges in all sorts of different ways, I suppose. And I suspect, if I'm totally honest, the technical solutions are not often the biggest challenges. It's often people who can be the biggest challenge, be it a client or sometimes another professional. Communication, I think, is so important, and being able to talk to people. And I often encourage my colleagues in the office, emails are necessary and we need to have audit trails and whatever, but picking up a phone and actually building a relationship and communicating with someone, you can move something forward an awful lot quicker using that technique rather than constant emails. That's not to say we haven't had plenty of challenges, and they sort of come in different ways. There's a project I'm working in at the moment in central London, where the building is going to be underpinned and then they're going to dig a 4-story hole below it. My job is to look after the historic fabric whilst they do that work. It's all consented and whatever. So there's some real technical challenges in that, and keeping an eye on the building as they're doing the works. So yeah, archaeology can be a major challenge as to how you deal with it and try to reduce the impact. So at Ely Cathedral, they wanted to put a mezzanine into the old library, but they don't want to dig down because there's going to be burials and the like, as well as there could be crypts, all sorts of things. So we designed a concrete raft foundation, but leaving breather gaps around the outside, and then we sat a frame on top of it. But there's a degree of how confident could we be with burials if there's going to be any settlement in it. So we said, look, we don't think there will be much based on what we're seeing once we've seen the formation level, but we actually built a mechanism into the columns, whereas if it did tilt one way or the other, we could actually jack up the columns a little bit to level the floor and down the line, because you're dealing with the unknown for some of the time. We could have done masses of investigation and intervention, but the costs would have spiraled probably, so the project wouldn't have been carried out, or we may not have got consent for it. So yeah, I mean, there's some really challenging stuff that we get involved, which is great.
That's problem solving on another level, isn't it?
You can't always take all the risk out of it. So the important thing is making it clear to your client what the risks are and balancing those risks against the likelihood, so they can make an informed decision about what they would like to do with our guidance.
Yeah, and it must be quite difficult when you get back from work to switch off, because your brain's still going. You're thinking, right, how can we do this? And it must be difficult, especially if you wake up in the middle of the night or something. But sometimes your best thinking happens then, oh, I know what we can do.
My wife keeps a pad beside the bed for that very reason. I have never resorted to that, but it's not been unknown that I will get up at 3 o'clock in the morning because you've woken up thinking, right, that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
And you have to go and write it down so it's clear in the morning.
Oh, amazing. And are there any other sort of innovative solutions that you've come across that have also been a bit unconventional?
Yeah, I think at Canterbury Cathedral, we were repairing a turret and the rafters were very small magnitude, they were sort of 3 inches square and of very high significance from an archaeological perspective. We had to joint, the tenons had all gone and the wall plates had gone. So we needed to renew the wall plates and we needed to find a way of connecting the rafters back into the new wall plates. And we couldn't do slip tenons because, with 3 inches, really, if you're cutting a chunk out of the middle, it doesn't really work. So we actually used carbon fibre slip tenons there. I think they ended up being 3 or 5 millimeters thick, essentially, and with carbon fibre dowels as well. So it was a way of reducing the amount of historic material that we were going to remove whilst using a modern material to replicate that tenon form, and probably confuse the hell out of the archaeologists in 100 or 200 years' time when they uncover it.
Mm. Could you explain to our viewers what a slip tenon is?
Well, if you have a mortise and tenon joint between two timber elements, if your tenon is decayed and therefore is no longer functioning, a slip tenon is a tenon which is essentially into the rafter or the member as well as into the joint. So it's pegged into both sides. It's a relatively conventional timber repair, I suppose.
Right. Right. Now, could you explain the process of assessing the structural integrity of a historic building? Could you just take us through the procedures of what you do? I know it's specific on or very certain projects, they're very different, but what you'd say, if you could say, a bog standard assessment.
Yeah. Well, ideally, we start with understanding. So, if somebody rings me up, I will do a bit of Google work, look at a list description if there is one, or a scheduling. In fact, I did one earlier this week, which was some ruins in Milton Keynes of an old church. I found an archaeological report, which actually had some drawings in the measured survey drawings, which the client, I don't think, was aware of.
Oh.
So a little bit of understanding, what you're going to see. Obviously, ask your client what the brief is, what you're trying to do. Are there any health and safety issues, etc.? I want to walk around the building externally first and then internally. And often if it's a multi-phase building, you start to build up a little picture in your head as to how the component parts, the different ages of the buildings fit together. I think once you've got a broad idea of the geography and geometry of the building, then you're starting to delve into the specifics. And I always start from the top down, because that's the way the loads work. They start at the top and they work their way down to the foundations. But I'm also looking for those clues the whole time you're walking around of where are the vulnerable areas. By and large, they will be where water can get trapped. So water is the big enemy of buildings, probably followed by people afterwards, I think, as the second big enemy. If you've walked around and you've understood where the vulnerabilities are, you're starting to build that picture also, the materials that have been used. Timber frame, masonry, if it's timber frame, what the infills are, the claddings. So I say you're building this picture the whole time, and then you'll go inside and you'll follow that same routine of working through from the top down, in the attic and then down the building, understanding how the loads are distributed, and also starting to piece together where alterations or issues may have infected the structural integrity. So, it could be a tie beam that is running across the building to resist roofs pushing out. They've added a floor or something. So you're looking for those inconsistencies with the buildings, the things which have changed, which might alter the load paths and how that building is working, or from fabric decay issues, be it water ingress or similar.
I would imagine intervention is a big one for you. It's where people have just put something in incorrectly, it hasn't been suited to the building, and it's caused other issues.
Yes, it's a huge thing, and we see it the whole time, but we also see in a way the reverse of that. So I went to a building where an engineer had not understood how some timber partitions were working, and there was some sagging of the lower floors. He had opened up and really not clearly understood the structure. So they installed an awful lot of temporary propping through different flats in the building and going through lath and plaster ceilings. And when I went there and looked at it, fully appreciated the form of the wall was a trussed partition. So the wall itself was a truss, and it was spreading the loads to the external walls and hanging the floor beam below. So it was a very different thing to what the other engineer thought. And I said to the owners, I said, you can take all this temporary propping out now. I don't have any issue with it. You do not need it. That just came from a misunderstanding of how the structure was working, and perhaps from lack of experience of not understanding about trussed partitions in historic building.
I would imagine also you with your experience, you now almost got X-ray vision. You look at a building, you can see, right, okay, this is when it was built. It's a timber frame, it's such and such, and you can actually take it all apart in your head to how it's constructed. You've got to really understand how that building was constructed in the first place.
It is, and by and large, the clues are always there, not 100% of the time. Sometimes it's hidden, but that particular building I was talking about just now, the clues were there to be found, and the other engineer could have easily, well, he saw the same as I did. It's just my understanding was different because I understood what the form of the structure was, and he hadn't seen it before, I suspect.
And what techniques do you use to ensure that minimal impact on the original structure during repairs and modifications? So, for instance, a lot of your work at historic buildings is very sensitive, and you have to go in and weigh up the options. The structural implications obviously overweigh anything that is historic fabric or something like that. Does that come up a lot where you, or do you normally, can you keep as much of the original material as possible?
You do have to compromise in some occasions, but again, it really comes back to understanding what is important and significant about the building. I think also it's important that understand how a building is going to be used. A good example of that is a building we worked on for English Heritage a few years ago, quite a lot of years ago now. English Heritage had just taken on the building, and there was one area of the building which had been used as an office, and they were going to use it as a museum. Museum loading is significantly higher than office loading. So theoretically, we were having to impose much greater loads on the floor than had been imposed before, which meant we were probably going to have to strengthen all the floors. So quite a significant intervention. However, what I sat down with the English Heritage and did, I said, well, can you explain how you're actually going to use this room? And they said, well, it's going to be permanent displays, so they're not going to change. And I said, well, can you tell me what the displays are? So size of cabinets, what's going in the cabinets. And we were able to work out essentially how much actual load was going to be applied to the floor, how much space there was left for visitors then. And therefore, we could come up with a realistic loading rather than the museum loading. And in fact, the realistic loading was less than office loading. So we ended up not having to do any strengthening to the floor at all.
God.
Of course, you have to ensure that that is going to be the permanent situation. And B, obviously, you have to have dialogue with building control in that instance to make sure that they were comfortable with the approach, and actually they bought into it completely. So for me, that's a real win-win situation. The client's not having to spend any money particularly on it, and we're not having to intervene with the historic fabric.
Obviously, a lot of these historic buildings have to pay for their keep. That they can't just sit. They have to be a money earner in a lot of cases. And when I worked at Kensington, for instance, you didn't have central heating when it was designed and built or modified by Christopher Wren in 1690. And then the 1880s, 1900s, the radiators came in have just absolutely dried the whole place out. But now, because they have 400,000 visitors every year at Kensington Palace, they've got to keep the heating up. Otherwise, people want to visit. So this building is not designed for modern use. That's another thing that you must come across a lot, where you've got to think, right, how can we modify this so it can be used, but we're not compromising?
Absolutely. I mean, probably a good example is Woollerton Hall up in Nottingham, which is a 1580s building by Robert Smithson. It's a fabulous building, and it had a very significant grant. And the city council, who are the owners of the building, said, as part of this project, we need to make sure we have access to all to the building, which essentially meant putting in a lift. However, the statutory authorities at the time said, there's no way you're cutting through 1580s fabric. We're just not going to do it. So there a great big long conversations. The city council said, understandably, if we can't put this lift in, we can't do this project. We cannot spend this money and not provide access to all. And it ended up going to a very senior advisory committee for the statutory body. And they overrode their officers and said, no, you've got 4 towers. We're going to sacrifice one of those towers to allow the lift to go up, but we will record all the fabric as it is removed. So, that was an intervention, a fairly significant intervention. But it related to the future viability of the building, income, revenue, etc. So, sometimes you do have to make hard decisions. And,
yes.
If buildings are not used, they won't be viable, they won't be cared for.
My next question is, how do you collaborate and work with other professionals, such as architects, conservators, surveyors? How does that work?
It works very well with the professionals with the right experience. So, we work with a huge number of different architects. I think the key thing is probably communication. And again, being able to talk to people openly and to collaborate. I like putting in ideas. They may be silly ideas sometimes, but I'd rather get them out there in case one of them might be a good idea. One of the key things I believe in on a similar front is talking to the contractors, the people actually doing the work. I learn a huge amount from, be it a carpenter, a mason, etc. And there's nothing that gives me more confidence in a project when we've got some tricky masonry and I sort of talk her through an idea, and then the mason says, well, I've got a different idea. I get incredibly frustrated if I meet somebody on site and they say, well, I'll just do what you tell me to do. That's somebody who's not going to be putting their thought process and heart and soul into the project, and not the type of people I'd want on site.
Yeah, the amount of times I've received a specification and I look at it, I think, why is this? At the early stages, the people that are actually doing the work should be brought in as part of the team. They should be brought in, because then, like I say, the amount of specifications I've looked at that have to be rewritten because they're not correct, because they're written by people that have not, they don't get their hands dirty. It happens time and time again. But even if it's not the people that are actually going to do that particular project, just bring in a really good skilled stonemason or a carpenter and bring them into the mix and say, right, this is the plan, and let's have a conversation.
Well, I did that only yesterday on a very tricky masonry building which has got a vault which is collapsing, and I said to the client, I said, we've come up with a methodology for doing it. I now want a mason down here to talk it through. Somebody's got the right sort of approach. It may be that we don't use that mason in the end to do the works, but it's that buildability experience is absolutely vital. Quite often I say to clients, if we're bringing in a contractor in an early stage in the development phase, they ought to be paid for that role as well, because they're giving advice which we're then using. And why wouldn't you pay them like you do other consultants?
And so to give people a picture, so a project comes in, it goes out to tender and you win the tender. Then what's the next step? Do you go on to site and you meet with the other professionals? Do you have a bit of a group meeting with the client and surveyors and the project managers? What happens initially?
I think every project is almost different. And yes, we tender. I think the other thing that is important is working out really what clients want sometimes, because I'm not entirely sure that they always know what they want. An example is I was asked to go look at a country house, and they said we need a condition survey. And it was quite a large project, and I was nearby. So I said, look, can I call in and have a look? And I walked around the building with them, and they said, oh, yeah, we're going to put an extension here, and we're going to do this there, and we're going to do that. And I was thinking, okay, well, this is great. I wasn't convinced that they were actually starting off on the right foot. And, them spending money on a condition survey, I didn't think was necessarily the right first step. And I said to them, I said, look, really, I think you need to do some understanding of where you're going in the future as an organization. And I suggested some consultants that I do quite a lot of work with, redevelopment consultants who work with heritage buildings. And they went and met them, and then they got employed. The end of the feasibility study was really interesting because they found that they weren't using the existing building to anywhere near its full potential. They were using it to sort of 20% of its potential. And they did not need any new extension at a cost of a few £1 million. They just needed to use what they'd got more carefully and logically. So, for me, that was I wasn't doing the condition survey, although I got to do it later. But it was doing, again, what was right for the building. And they brought in an architect to do the feasibility and viability. So I think every project's the same. In the example you gave, yes, we might tender as part of a consortium, so we're in a team already, or it might tender as a structural engineer. The first thing is to go there, get to know the people, get to know the building, talk to the people who know the building the best as well. Any maintenance people if it's a large project, because there's lots of information probably there which is really useful. If you don't ask, you won't know it.
Yeah. I'm really interested to find out your involvement with Westminster Abbey. I incredibly have never visited Westminster Abbey. I'm so ashamed. I lived in London for about 3.5 years when I was in my late 20s. And I think it was just then that they were starting to charge people to go in. I didn't have a lot of money, and I just didn't pay for the tickets. I never went in, but I have to go because, like I say, I've never been. Just tell me a little bit about your involvement. How long have you been involved with Westminster Abbey, and what's your is it an ongoing sort of maintenance check, or how does it work?
No, so cathedrals generally have a surveyor to the fabric appointed. That's a legal appointment, essentially, and the surveyor's role, often an architect, the surveyor's role is to do the quinquennial inspection reports every 5 years, and that will then bring up a whole series of work items. So I'm there to sit alongside the surveyor to the fabric and be called in when there is an element of structural concern, and it can be very wide-ranging. So obviously at the Abbey, we had the Queen Elizabeth galleries, which we did at triforium level, which was a very significant project. But you might get called in because they want to be putting some scaffold on top of a section of roof, and they want to be confident that the roof has got the capability of taking that. So it's really very varied. And of course, all the cathedrals and the Abbey have a huge number of other buildings around the precincts and the estates that they have to manage as well. You often will get a call to go down to look at one thing, and you end up looking at 3 or 4 different things while you're there. So it's always a voyage of discovery and really fantastically interesting.
But again, even if it's one small aspect of the building, you've got to understand the complete construction of the whole Abbey to understand why that's a defect in that possible area. I mean, it's not just you're going there to fix that. You've got to say, okay, I understand that the whole construction, and that to me is just daunting.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on the nature of the project you're doing, I suppose. So we did look at a project of completing the crossing tower quite a lot of years ago. And, that would have had major impacts of putting several hundred tons of further masonry on top of the central crossing. But equally, it may be advice on hanging a piece of sculpture. or hanging something off a wall. It can be very local, and therefore you don't need to have that big picture for that little bit of advice. It may be bringing a cherry picker in. Can we bring a cherry picker in over a floor so we can get high level access to inspect? So it's incredibly varied, and you never quite know what it might be next time.
And would there be constant work at Westminster Abbey for a stonemason? Are they constantly working on the Abbey?
They're constantly working, but different cathedrals have different ways of managing it. Some cathedrals have much bigger works departments, some have relatively modest works department, and which fluctuate with the money that they've got available. What you do get is masons which might move around the country. York Minster had the York Minster Revealed project 15 years ago, which probably finished in about 10 years. So they had to up the number of masons that they had in the works department. When that finished, it so happened that Canterbury Cathedral had the Canterbury Journey starting. So some of the masons from York moved down to Canterbury. It fluctuates, and what you find is that the masons move around, and you often come across a mason who you've known from a previous project.
Was your father involved in York Minster and Westminster Abbey?
No, my father was engineer at Canterbury Cathedral.
Okay.
And I took over the role from him when he got close to retirement. And he also sat on Westminster Abbey Fabric Advisory Committee. I've been lucky enough to work on some of the other cathedrals, which has just been amazing and fantastic.
It's mind-blowing, the amount of knowledge that and you have to retain.
Try and retain, is the right way of putting it. I have to take refreshers when I go to. There's some elements of buildings that you get to know really well, and I was involved in a very significant project at Canterbury Cathedral, which was the southwest transept and the Great South Window. I've got dates in my head from that, and because I give talks about it quite regularly, that's sort of right at the front of my mind. But if I move to another part of the cathedral, I might need to refresh my memory as to how it fits into the big picture.
And how do you, I mean, it's lucky you're very interested in the subject and you're passionate about it, but you have to understand so many disciplines. You really have to have a good grasp on glass and lead and wood and everything.
Yeah, I think you have to have a reasonable understanding, but I think it's also knowing the right people ask essentially. Some of the cathedrals were very lucky, they've got masons, they've got glaziers, the architect has an office at the site, and the surveyor has got some really good colleagues working there. My colleague Sarah does most of the work at Canterbury Cathedral now. She goes down there probably twice a month at least with ongoing projects. So yes, having contacts and knowing who to ask is really important. And I spend a lot of time ringing people up just for a little bit of advice, saying, I've got this situation, what do you think? And it just gets your mind ticking over in the right way, and helps you decide whether actually you need to bring that advice and expertise in formally to a project or not, as the case may be.
Now, how would you measure the success of a heritage building project once it's completed?
Well, I suppose you can measure it on different levels. Personally, a lot of the time, it's quite nice if work that we've been carried out isn't too noticeable, but it's a light touch. If you're looking carefully, you want to be able to see the evidence of what we've done. You're not trying to conceal those repairs and changes. Hopefully a happy client is a good thing. Often you get personal satisfaction out of something as well. I suppose an example, Bodiam Castle, I got asked to look at the portcullis quite a lot of years ago. Everybody got quite excited because it appears to be the original portcullis, which means it's actually very significant and very rare. And my role was to make sure that the portcullis didn't end up falling down on children and the like passing through the gate. But it evolved into a really interesting discussion. The National Trust had two different perspectives on it. One perspective was, gosh, if this is the original portcullis, maybe we ought to put it into museum conditions. The other side of the argument was, well, if that's the original portcullis, it really ought to stay where it belongs. And I got involved in that dialogue, and they sort of asked views. And I said, well, to me, I think the fundamental thing is actually understand what the moisture content is in the timber. Is there enough moisture in it that actually it will continue to decay or not? So we had Brian Ridout come down and set up moisture monitoring. And after a couple of years, they found that the moisture content was so low that decay would not continue. And therefore, we didn't have to do anything with it. From a safety point of view, we made sure that it wasn't going to fall down, which is quite tricky when you can't actually see it because it's up inside a slot in the wall. So we devised a way of putting some temporary support and then loading it to make sure that it was, robust essentially. But for me, that was a great solution, a great result, because it was a do nothing. And if you can walk away and do nothing, that can be really, really satisfying.
There's some that is so satisfying. And actually, was it original? Bodiam is 3 miles down the road from me.
It's built of chestnut, but they're only 3.5-inch square. And the way it's all tenoned together, you can only get it in there when you're building it. So there wasn't room enough. And the way, because it's jointed mortise and tenon at both ends, you can't disentangle. There isn't room to sort of take the end off and then slowly unpick it. So yeah, it's thought to be original.
That's incredible. I can't remember the date of Bodiam. Do you remember what the date is?
No, not off the top. I honestly can't remember, Vincent.
What sort of legacy would you like to leave in the field of conservation through your work?
To me personally, education, I think, is very high up the list. I do a lot of lecturing and I thoroughly enjoy it, being able to pass over some knowledge. The course I mentioned in Jersey, where there was quite a lot of engineers, it was fantastic that several of those engineers really got it. Talking to them afterwards, they were really enthusiastic and they've got the sort of philosophy of it, knowing that they've taken something really positive away from it. I've had emails from one of them at least now asking me further questions. I think that's great because that's going to hopefully benefit other historic buildings in due course.
And would you say is there still a resistance to a holistic approach nowadays, with people just panicking and say, let's put some steels in because we know it's going to last? Are people coming on board with it?
No, I think there's still a lot of cases where inappropriate works are being carried out in historic buildings. I think the statutory bodies are, where they have the resources, of course, are better informed and have the ability to question more.
Okay.
But it's not a guarantee by any means. And I've seen some horrific things in historic buildings and just don't understand how they could have ever been permitted. That's
going to be ongoing.
The big one for me at the moment is demolition of historic assets. And, I've become involved in quite a few cases of that. And I sit on the Conservation Accreditation Register for Engineers panel, CARE, and we've produced a guidance note on demolition of historic buildings and assets, which we think will be a tremendously powerful tool for use by local authorities. Because at the moment, a local authority receives an application and it's got an engineer's report, and conservation officers say to me, we're not qualified to actually query that report. So, it puts them into difficulty. Sometimes they can tell the agent or the applicant to have a care engineer overview it, but sometimes they don't. So having some guidance which says this is a sort of procedure you ought to be following when considering demolition or partial demolition of a historic asset should hopefully be really useful. So that's a note which is currently out to consultation with Historic England, Historic Environment Scotland, CADU, IHBC, SPAB. So we've had a lot of feedback already and everybody's very positive about it. It's already in use because it's been published by the two institutions, but we're hoping to get lots of endorsements on the updated one, which we'll issue shortly. And as I say, can hopefully be a real benefit in helping save some historic buildings.
That's fantastic, because they are a lot of the time sort of what's the term, rabbit in the headlights, isn't it? They'll get something on their desk saying, well, this building, it's been certified by an engineer that it's unsafe and it's got to be pulled down, and then there's no question, well, that person's absolutely said that, so that's what we're going to have to do. It's such a shame we're going to lose this building, but that's just the way it is. And
it's staggering that some of them. I went to one in Essex where basically they had lots of mold inside the building, and it was significant, but that was being used as a justification for demolition of the building.
Oh, wow.
It's just shocking. Interestingly, I advised the local authority on that one initially on a desktop basis, and then the applicant employed me to go and do a survey, convinced that I was going to say that it needed demolition. And of course I didn't. And they said they wouldn't permit me to pass that report on to the local authority. Yeah. But the local authority knew I was doing the report, so they knew it was out there.
Okay.
So I think they collared the owner in the end and said, well, we know the report's been done. We think you ought to let us have it.
How do you see the future of heritage conservation? What do you see? Are the youngsters coming in? Is there still the interest? Who's going to be taking over from you when you retire?
Well, I'm very lucky that we've got an office full of very enthusiastic engineers and technicians who, some of them come to us without really having that historic building experience. But when they leave us, because inevitably that happens to some, they've got a real enthusiasm and understanding. I'm lucky enough that I do quite a lot of lecturing, and you see quite a lot of young engineers now coming through who really do have that interest and passion. I'm really keen. We've got 80 engineers on the accreditation register at the moment. I'm keen to get that over 100. So 80 is good, but we need more. I think the other thing which I see is a huge change in how conservation was 25 years ago to how it is now. Probably a quick example is at Canterbury Cathedral, the north oculus window. 25 years ago, when my father was the engineer, we discussed the 12th century iron window, and the surveyor to the fabric, my father, myself, involved a blacksmith, and the clerk of work sort of broadly decided what we were going to do and sort of got consent and got on and did it. And we did the south oculus window probably 5 years ago, and there was a sort of 2-year research project to establish what we ought to do and how we ought to do it. I'm absolutely convinced what we did 5 years ago is going to be more durable than what we did 25 years ago. There was so much more understanding and knowledge that went into it. So it's fantastic the way conservation has moved forward. But you've got the challenges of approach costs more money in terms of consultants and then actually doing the works. But it's for the best long-term interests of the building or structure.
So it's not in a bad shape then if you've got your team of younger people coming through, and it seems like it's in a better state than my profession, conserving and restoring period woodwork. There's hardly anybody coming through.
Yeah. I still see shortages, maybe not on the engineering side so much, but from the craft side, bricklayers. There's some fantastic bricklayers out there, but they can be paid 3 times more to go and bang up some brick boxes for one of the house builders. If you're a young person with potentially a family, unfortunately, you're going to be drawn to where the money is, even if the interest isn't there.
Yeah, that happened to me. I had a great guy in his early 20s. He was fantastic. He loved doing the work, but he was offered another £30 a day with the company, making kitchens with CNC machines, and he took it.
I know, and it's frustrating and difficult. But no, there's some really good university degrees or postgraduate diplomas and masters which are encouraging work in historic buildings and historic engineering. So, they're a good source of people coming into the industry as well.
Yeah. And when I meet some youngsters that are either training as architects or engineers or surveyors, I always encourage them. I say, have you thought about historic buildings? Because there's an absolute need. I think so many people go into the modern buildings. They just want to do modern stuff, but they don't realize that once you get into it, and it took me a time because I had such a terrible history teacher at school, so I hated history. But when I got into my woodwork, I became so passionate about history, and it just is an amazing industry to be in. And I try and encourage youngsters to, what about the historic side?
I think some of it is, university courses that aren't driven towards existing structures. And certainly when I did mine, we didn't go to one building. And I think it's changed now. I think they are better, and there are better university courses.
Mm.
We're lucky enough that you do get those enthusiastic people, and they stand out a mile when the application comes in or the CV comes in, and then you meet them and you know very early on if they're the right sort of person to go forward in a career with historic buildings.
Yeah, and it's also, we have a responsibility, you and I, to tell the story. History is fantastic if you have the right teacher and you can get people enthused. I've met with people I've had working for me, and after a couple of years they said, God, I'm really into this now, I'm really enjoying this. Look at that old floorboard there, look, it's got some hand saw marks on, and they never would have realized that.
No, and it's very gratifying as well.
So we're coming towards the end. Who would you say your biggest, I think I know who you're going to say, but your biggest influences or mentors?
Well, inevitably my father is going to be very high up there, because he was one of the first engineers to be involved in conservation in a big way.
Amazing.
So he's very high. But I get inspired by lots of other people I meet. One of the fantastic things in our industry is that there's some really interesting characters which have huge knowledge. I can easily get inspired by an archaeologist, an architect, etc. But my father was probably at the top.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And this is what I'm hoping this podcast will do, is to get some of those individuals on so they can share their passion and knowledge to some of the younger generation, and hopefully they get interested and think, oh, I quite fancy that. And could you just recommend any books or websites for our listeners, or where could they learn more about your industry?
I think conservation courses are great. It comes back to communication and meeting people, and there's a huge number around the country now. I think with the conservation accreditation process, when I was interviewing candidates, I always ask about lime mortar. I asked the engineer, have you ever specified a lime mortar? Because I think it's important that an engineer understands lime and is able to specify. Quite a lot of them say, well, we haven't really had to, that's the architect's job, which I disagree with. Therefore, I suggest to them that they need to go on a course related to lime mortars. So there's lots of fantastic places. Because I live in Essex, Place Services do a whole host of different courses. And in fact, you do one now as well, Vincent.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
No, I think that's a good and actually quite a low cost course in terms of what they charge.
Yeah.
But there's many others around the country. If engineers, particularly any engineers listening to this, care is what they should be aspiring to, and information is available on the Institution of Civil Engineers website and the Institution of Structural Engineers, and indeed for other professionals or contractors, craftspeople, if they need a conservation engineer, that's the place to look, really. They have gone through a fairly rigorous process to get there.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Before we say goodbye, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, we have a website, and I'm always very happy to talk to people on an individual basis. So contact the office, and we have offices in London, Suffolk, although I've also got colleagues now living in Newcastle and Sheffield. So contact the office, ask for my details or my email. Always happy to chat through anything to do with conservation, really.
Thank you very much. We'll include all the details in our episode notes. So thank you very much for joining us, Ed. It's been an absolute pleasure, and take care and goodbye for now.
Thanks very much, Vincent. Enjoyed it.